Welcome back to Fund Your Future with DRS. Today, we're talking about everyone's favorite subject, COLAs, which stands for Cost of Living Adjustment. So basically, at the end of each July, most retirees receive a cost of living adjustment on their pension. And the COLA can increase up to 3% each year, and it's based on the Consumer Price Index for Urban Workers, or CPI-U, in the greater Seattle area. So, to learn a little bit more about this CPI-U, we've invited Matt Smith, the state actuary, back to the podcast. Welcome, Matt.
Thank you. Great to be here.
So, Matt, state law ties the pension for COLAs to the Seattle CPI-U, as Jenny mentioned. And first, could you just explain to our listeners what the Consumer Price Index is, what it's trying to measure, and how it's calculated?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I don't consider myself to be an expert on the CPI, but I've worked with it quite a bit over the years. As you mentioned, directly tied to our retirement system. So I definitely can share what I know, what I've learned over the years. At the highest level, it's really just measuring price inflation. How is the price of, various goods that we buy as consumers in a particular region, how is it changing from one period to another?
Yeah, and as we mentioned before, most of our retirees will see a COLA increase on the pension payment that they receive at the end of July. How does CPI determine the amount of that COLA?
Yeah, and going back to the first question, this price inflation, the Bureau of Labor Statistics will calculate this index and think of it as a basket of goods that folks are assumed to buy. Things like the cost of housing, the cost of transportation, food and beverages, healthcare. The BLS, Bureau of Labor Statistics, will go out periodically and do surveys for consumers in various regions and come up with sort of like what the assumed basket of goods that we buy, and then sort of document what's the average price of those things, assuming that you buy those things at those assumed proportions. And then look at that same basket of goods a month later, 6 months later, a year later, and measure how much has the price increased. That would be your price inflation. And in our state, the calculation is done on an annual basis. It's looking at the change in that basket of goods on a calendar year basis. For the retirees that just received a COLA on July 1st, 2025, it would have looked at the change in prices from calendar year 23 to the end of calendar year 24. So it's not necessarily the inflation you're experiencing right now in this moment. Think of it as more of a calendar year impact in the change in prices.
I really appreciate that, Matt. And I think for a lot of our listeners, and especially our younger listeners, inflation hasn't been something that we ever dealt with or lived with or thought much about. And I know at DRS over the last few years, we've had lots and lots more questions about COLAs and about inflation. And so trying to get a little bit better understanding of the way that CPI is calculated, I think will be helpful for everyone. One of the things I wanted to mention, I recently read a book called Who is Government? It had profiled a bunch of public workers and the great work they've done and profiled 10 or 12 individuals. But one of the profiles was of the Bureau of Labor Statistics and the calculation of CPI and why it's important. Because as you mentioned, understanding how prices change over time in some sort of consistent scientific way is really helpful to think about how I'm budgeting things, how I'm going to spend my money. And I think it's important to recognize that it's not a perfect calculation for each individual. And I'm hoping you can expand on this a little bit because you were talking about this basket of goods. And one of the things when I think about inflation, I think back to COVID in 2020, and people were talking about how much their budget changed because they were spending money on different things. They were maybe driving less, and so the cost of gas wasn't impacting their budget as much. And can you just explain a little bit about how a retiree might experience inflation different than how the Bureau of Labor Statistics is calculating our CPI for the COLA adjustment?
Happy to. Yeah, I think it's a great observation. I think the first one that comes to my mind would be the basket of goods, right? So the CPI-U or the CPI-W, the more technical long-term name is like urban wage earners or clerical workers. So it's measuring inflation on the goods that workers are consuming or buying. It's not based on retirees, and retirees are most likely, buying different goods. Their proportion of, their basket, if you will, is going to be made up of different things. Could be higher healthcare costs than a worker. So that's probably step one. Is it's not measuring the inflation that a retiree is likely experiencing, and it wasn't necessarily a policy choice. I mean, that was just the way it was defined when the plan was created. Some of them back in the 1930s and the 1940s, and our plans 2, 3, the 1970s. I think there's only an experimental CPI that's based on retirees. So it's not like there's something out there that we're not using. It just really wasn't set up that way. The other thing that comes to mind would be, I mentioned earlier that it's based on this basket of goods, but particular to a region. So our plans are typically set to the Seattle, Tacoma, Bellevue region, where a large proportion of our state workers probably reside, but not all of them. Retirees, as you know, as the plan administrator, they all don't live in Washington state. Some live outside Washington state and some live in other countries. So the inflation they're experiencing could be significantly different depending on where they live.
I really appreciate that point about retirees spending money differently than the average worker and thinking about how inflation impacts people differently. I think our office has definitely heard from people and not understanding that the CPI that's being used is that annual adjustment. And so, as you said, the COLA that people are going to get in 2025 is based off inflation from 23 and 24, the difference between those 2 years. And oftentimes, what is reported in the news is month over month inflation or year over year inflation, but it's April to April and not, year end to year end. So there are all sorts of different numbers out there, and I think it can make people a little bit distrustful of the process and understanding that really this is just the best measurement we have. And this is, as you said, one measurement that was selected 30, 40 years ago for our plans, and it is a consistent measure. And so hopefully this conversation helps build a little bit more trust in the process. Is there anything else you want people to think about with COLAs or maybe something that comes up in your office with the CPI that might be beneficial for folks to know?
I might just expand on one of the points you mentioned earlier. I think that the timing is a huge, huge thing in the measurement period. We've definitely observed more attention to inflation and inflation being a lot higher than it has been maybe the prior, 20 years. And like you mentioned, you'll hear reports about particular areas of inflation that just really jump up, like avian flu and the price of eggs. I think we all can remember, a news story for quite a while. Seems like it's gone away, didn't persist for an entire year. You might not even eat eggs, right? Another thing that maybe works to a retiree's advantage in this space is the CPI measurements don't frequently get updated for substitutions. So we as consumers will freely substitute goods, and maybe we move away from something that are experiencing a bit of price inflation. The BLS does update their surveys, does update the basket of goods, but not that frequently. So yeah, there's kind of pros and cons to it, but I think you hit on a couple of really key points too, is that this is something defined in statute, right? This is something the legislature implemented when the plans were first initiated, not a policy decision or a DRS decision where you decide appropriate CPI or whether it's tracking well or not well. It really is, the contract provision, if you will, of our plans that was established when they first were created. And other than the BLS making some changes in how they perform their measurements, I'm not aware of any CPI that has been statutorily changed for our plans.
And Matt, you kind of mentioned this earlier about how it's based on what workers are consuming, not exactly what retirees are consuming. And has there been any sort of discussion about changing those measurements?
I haven't heard any discussions at the Washington state level in terms of policy. The only thing I'm aware of is that, as I mentioned earlier, that the Bureau of Labor Statistics does have this, what they call an experimental CPI, where they do track different basket of goods for retirees, assuming they did that for a reason and to compare it to, the consumer-based or worker-based CPIs. But I've never seen them do anything with it or it lead to any policy changes.
Gotcha.
I want to thank you for joining us, but I also did want to help our listeners realize that COLAs on pension plans aren't always common across the country. And this is a really beneficial feature for our plans, or for our plans 2s and 3s that have this COLA based on the inflation index for the area. I'm curious if you have any thoughts on that you would like to share with the audience as well?
I think it's a great observation. I don't have exact numbers, in terms of like how many public plans have them or don't have them, but a fair amount of them don't for sure. They manage them on more of an ad hoc basis, meaning that maybe here or there they will add those on. They can be expensive if it's something that you're adding at the end of the plan's life. From a plan design perspective, this is something from an actuary's perspective, that you really want to be thinking of early on in the plan design. You want to be funding for it. Modeling future inflation makes it a lot more affordable than having to manage it on an ad hoc basis once someone's already retired. So, in our state, we're fortunate with our plans 2, 3s to have had those in place from the very beginning. For the plans 1, they weren't part of the original plan design. Plans 1, public employees and teachers. And that's led to, an ongoing challenge for those retirees, challenge for the legislature to find a way to be able to afford adding those COLAs for retirees in a plan design where it really wasn't considered something that was part of the original plan design.
Gotcha.
Great. Thanks for talking with us about COLAs, Matt.
Thanks for listening, and now we'd love to hear from you. What topics would you like to hear about? What questions do you have for us? Send an email to drs.podcasts@drs.wa.gov. That's drspodcasts@drs.wa.gov. The Department of Retirement Systems provides this podcast as a public service, but it's neither a legal interpretation nor a statement of DRS policy. References to any specific product or entity do not constitute an endorsement or recommendation. The views expressed by guests are their own, and their appearance on the program does not imply an endorsement of them or any entity they represent. Views and opinions expressed by DRS employees are those of the employees and do not necessarily reflect the view of DRS or any of its officials.